We've got just over a month before Halloween, and all the Halloween stores are popping up. Have you noticed? I don't know about you, but I find it fun sometimes to meander through them and look at all this stuff. But, if I'm honest, I tend to walk very quickly past the aisles that have those creepy dolls and the ones that have the rabid-looking forest animals. I know they're pretend. I am an adult. But sometimes those images have a way of slithering into my subconscious and ending up in my nightmares. That ever happened to you? Mostly those are not what my nightmares are made of. I've had two forms of nightmares that repeat. One is that I can't find one of my daughters. I'm searching and searching, and going through one obstacle after another, and I just can't get to her. When I wake up in a cold sweat, I go and kiss my sleeping babies. The other nightmare that happens much too often is that I find out that I'm supposed to preach, and I don't even know what the gospel is, and I can't think of anything to say, and I'm totally unprepared. And so I run back to my office, which in my dream is miles and miles away, and search through my computer, and nothing will print, and I can't find a sermon, and you all are waiting here for hours. And I have totally failed you. Well, we know that one will never happen. Not that I would never come unprepared, but you all probably wouldn't wait more than 5 minutes for me without coming out. What about you? What are you afraid of? Do you also have fears of losing someone you love?
Yeah.
Do you also have fears of failure? Do you fear the future? Do you fear your past haunting you? Do you fear being forgotten? Do you fear not mattering? Do you fear not being good enough? Or not enough? So often when we're afraid or anxious, we tend to lash out. Do you notice? Studies show that when we are scared, we tend to seek comfort in places that are familiar or predictable, even if they are not necessarily safe. We still know what to expect. And we close our ears and stop listening or imagining anything could be different. We dig into our position even if an alternative view makes more sense. And often we seek positions of power and status because we imagine that then maybe we can control what we're scared of. Does any of this sound familiar to you? If so, we're in good company. Today we heard in Mark's Gospel about a situation in which Jesus' disciples were afraid. Jesus had just shared with them for the second time about how he would suffer and be rejected and killed and rise. And the disciples couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. It was all too confusing to them. It was over their heads. It was beyond them. And when they looked around, everyone else seemed to be nodding their head like they understood. Have you ever been in a room like that? Everyone's nodding their head. You can do it now. Pretend you understand what I'm talking about. No one else does. And so because of that, no one wanted to ask Jesus clarifying questions because they didn't want to risk appearing a fool. Mark tells us that the disciples were afraid. They were afraid of speaking up, speaking their truth. They were afraid of looking stupid. And so, instead of having a discussion with Jesus to ask him to further explain what he had been talking about, the disciples turn to each other and start bickering over who among them is the greatest. You see, these students dealt with their fear of being meager by seeking out positions of power and status. They wanted that control. They were one-upping each other, and most certainly, in doing so, tearing one another down. They were terrified, and so they terrorized. Now, Jesus, being the good teacher he is, was on to them. And so he took a child who, in that culture, at that time, should have been with its mother, not there with these men. A child who was probably dirty with a snotty nose, because that's how they often are. A child, though, who, because of the high child mortality rates, society would not pay any attention to. They were considered some of the lowest of the low. Kind of the opposite of how it is now, but at that time, they had no status. And Jesus directed his disciples that if they wanted to be great, they needed to welcome those who no one else thought was great. Jesus took the disciples' fear and anxiety and false sense of security and turned it all upside down. And that's what this passage does with us. Jesus points to our fears and turns them upside down. Jesus shows us and teaches us that having abundant life isn't about having power or status, but we have abundant life when we welcome those who are powerless. I mean, Jesus could have said to the disciples, it's all good. It doesn't matter which of you is the greatest because you're all greater than all of those people. But no. Instead, Jesus called his disciples out of their comfort zone into uncharted territory and into relationship with those they might not otherwise bat an eye at. Jesus doesn't negate our fears, but he walks through them with us. He opens our eyes to the evidence that we are not alone. that God is with us. And he helps us to remember that God will never forget us, that we are loved, we are forgiven, we matter, we can be made whole. Jesus invites us to come in last and welcome those who everyone else might turn their backs on. And in doing so, we welcome Christ. Because Jesus humbled himself to be rejected, to suffer, to be crucified, we know that he knows our fears. He has been there. And he is there for us. When we feel like the walls are all caving in on us, when it might seem like there is no way out, when we are lonely and confused and don't seem to have any control over anything, Jesus is there, loving us, welcoming us, promising us resurrection, and shining his light in our darkness so that we can trust that in his presence we never need to be scared of anything.